The morning Henrietta Hale walked 6 miles through red Arizona dust with her 9-year-old son on her hip and nothing but a cracked leather satchel in her hand. She had already made peace with the idea that a woman in her position had very little left to lose. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was not a kind place for a woman alone. It was a land of copper-colored earth and relentless sun, of rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of Joshua trees, of men who built empires from cattle and sweat, and looked at a widow with a young boy the way a gambler looked at a losing hand, with a kind of tired, dismissive pity that was almost worse than cruelty. Henrietta had experienced both in the 6 months since her husband, Robert Hale, had been taken by a fever that swept through the small mining settlement of Dusty Creek in the winter of 1877. Robert had been a good man, a decent man, a man who had held her hand when the fever was at its worst and told her that she was the strongest person he had ever known. She had not felt strong then, and she did not feel strong now, but she kept walking because her son, Jacob, needed her too. Jacob was 9 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. He had not cried when his father died, not because he had not felt it, but because he had seen his mother not crying and decided that he would follow her example. Henrietta had cried, but only at night, when Jacob was asleep and the settlement was quiet, and she had pressed her face into the rough blanket and let herself fall apart for exactly as long as she could afford. Then she put herself back together and started figuring out what to do next. What she had done next was spend 6 months trying to stay in Dusty Creek, taking in washing and mending and cooking for the single miners who came through, stretching every coin Robert had left behind until there were no more coins to stretch. The settlement had a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Calhoun, who had been kind enough to let Henrietta and Jacob stay in a back room for reduced wages. But even Mrs. Calhoun had limits, and those limits had been reached on a Tuesday morning when the landlord from Tucson arrived and announced that the boarding house itself was behind on its property taxes and needed to show a profit or be seized. So Henrietta had packed what she had, which was not much, and she had walked out of Dusty Creek with Jacob beside her and asked the first person she encountered on the road about work anywhere nearby. The person had been an old Navajo man leading a mule, and he had looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had seen every kind of desperation the territory had to offer, and he had told her about a ranch called the Broken Spur, about 12 miles south, run by a man named Theodore Morgan. He had said it plainly, without embellishment. Theodore Morgan was known to be fair. He had said it the way you said something about the weather, as a simple, observable fact. Henrietta had thanked him and turned south. She had been walking for 2 hours when she saw the gate. It was a proper gate, not like the rough-hewn posts of the smaller homesteads she had passed. It was made of thick timber posts sunk deep into the red earth, with a crossbeam above that had the words Broken Spur burned into the wood in letters that were uneven but deliberate, as if the man who had made them had taken his time because he wanted them to last. Beyond the gate, a long dirt road curved through a field of pale grass toward a cluster of buildings, a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like a bunkhouse set off to one side. Cattle moved slowly in the distance, dark shapes against the heat shimmer. Henrietta stopped at the gate and looked at it for a moment. Jacob looked up at her. "Are we going in?" "We are," she said, and she unlatched the gate and walked through. She had not gone 50 yards down the road before a man appeared from around the side of the barn. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that you noticed even from a distance, with broad shoulders and a build that spoke of years of physical labor, not decoration. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, and he had a hat that had seen better days pushed back on his head, in a way that suggested he had pushed it there without thinking about it. He was perhaps 35, with a face that was weathered in the way of men who spent most of their waking hours outdoors, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that was sharp under a growth of dark beard that was not quite a beard and not quite a shave. He stopped when he saw her. He did not reach for anything, did not call out, just stopped and looked at her the way a careful man looks at something unexpected, with attention rather than alarm. Henrietta kept walking toward him, and when she was close enough that she did not have to raise her voice, she stopped. "I am looking for Theodore Morgan," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and even, not unfriendly but not performing friendliness either. "My name is Henrietta Hale. My husband passed 6 months ago. I have been managing since then, but the situation in Dusty Creek has changed and I need work." She said it directly, without apology, because she had decided on the walk over that she was not going to apologize for her circumstances. "I have my son with me. His name is Jacob. He is 9 years old and he is willing to work. I was going to ask if you had need of a boy who could mend fence and haul water and do whatever other small work needed doing." She paused. "But I would also like to ask about work for myself, if you have it. I can cook, I can keep a house clean, I can mend clothes and harness leather, and I can doctor minor wounds if it comes to it. I am not afraid of hard work and I will not cause trouble." Theodore Morgan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jacob, who was standing very straight beside his mother with his chin up in a way that was almost heartbreaking in its dignity. Then he looked back at Henrietta. "How far did you walk?" he said. "About 6 miles from where I last slept," she said. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He looked at the satchel in her hand, at the dust on her skirt, at the resolute set of her face that told him she had already considered the possibility that he would say no and had made her peace with it. "I asked only about the boy working," he said carefully. "I know," she said, "but I am asking about both of us." Something shifted in his expression then, not softening exactly, but opening like a window that had been shut for a long time and was now being considered. "The boy can work," he said. "So can you." He paused. "You can both stay." Henrietta let out a breath that she had been holding for longer than she realized. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with everything she had. "Don't thank me yet," Theodore said. He turned and gestured for them to follow him toward the main house. "It's hard work and the hours are long. I'll be straight with you about that." "I wouldn't want you to be anything else," she said. He glanced back at her over his shoulder at that, a quick, assessing look, and she thought she saw something flicker at the edge of his expression, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might have been if he had been the kind of man who smiled easily. He was not, she would learn, but the smiles he had were worth the waiting. The main house of the Broken Spur was larger than it looked from the gate. It had been built in stages. Henrietta could see a central room that was old, with thick adobe walls and a low ceiling, and then additions on either side that were newer timber construction, with windows that let in the fierce afternoon light. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room all at once, with a long table that could seat 8, a cast iron stove that dominated one wall, and shelves lined with canned goods and tools and books that surprised her. The books were not decorative. They were well thumbed, with cracked spines and pages that had been turned many times. "The room at the back is yours," Theodore said, stopping at the door to indicate a hallway. "There's a cot in the room beside it for the boy. It's not much, but it's private and the roof doesn't leak, which is more than I can say for the bunkhouse." "It's more than enough," Henrietta said. Jacob, who had been quietly taking in everything around him with the wide, careful eyes of a child who had learned to observe before speaking, tugged gently at Henrietta's sleeve. She looked down at him. "Can I see the horses?" he asked. Theodore looked at the boy. "Can you handle horses?" Jacob considered this seriously. "I've been around them. My father had a mule. I know to move slow and not shout." "That's more than some of my hands know," Theodore said. He crouched down to be at Jacob's eye level, which surprised Henrietta. Most men did not think to do that. "After your mother's settled, I'll take you to the barn myself. There's a pinto mare that's been disagreeable with everyone else. We'll see what she makes of you." Jacob's face changed entirely. The careful, dignified mask of a boy trying to be older than he was cracked open, and underneath, it was just a 9-year-old who wanted very much to see horses. And it was such a purely joyful expression that Henrietta felt the back of her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Yes, sir," Jacob said. Theodore stood back up and caught Henrietta's eye, and she saw that he had noticed the same thing she had: the crack in the boy's composure, the relief of it, and something in his face was not quite the place where a smile might be anymore. It was the actual thing, brief and quiet, but real. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said. The kitchen situation was, by any standard, a disaster. Theodore Morgan was a competent man in almost every measurable way. His ranch was well run, his fences were maintained, his cattle were healthy, and his ledgers were balanced, but he could not cook. This became apparent within the first 10 minutes as he showed Henrietta around the stove, and she opened the cast iron pot on the back burner and found something that had been intended as a stew and had become something else entirely. "I've been managing," he said, with the tone of a man who had been telling himself this for some time. "How long have you been cooking for yourself?" she asked. A pause. "About 3 years. Since your wife passed," she said, and then immediately wished she had not, because it was too direct and too soon, and she had no business. "Since she left," he said. He said it without particular emotion, but with the flatness of something that had been said so many times it had worn smooth. "Clara left in the spring of '75, took the stage to Tucson, and then I believe she went on to California. I haven't heard from her since." "I'm sorry," Henrietta said. "Don't be," he said. "It wasn't a good marriage. We both knew it. She deserved better than a ranch at the end of the world, and I deserved better than someone who hated every inch of it." He said this without self-pity, as a simple assessment. "I should dump that stew." "Let me look at it first," Henrietta said. She tasted a very small amount with the edge of a spoon, considered, and said, "I can fix it. It just needs more time and some of these." She opened a tin on the shelf and found dried beans. "And those." She pointed to a string of dried chilies hanging by the window. He watched her move through his kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to work in a space, and he said nothing, just moved out of her way when she needed to get past him and handed her things when she reached for them. It was a small thing, but Henrietta noticed it, the way he read the room and adjusted without being asked. Robert had done the same thing, and she had not realized until this moment how much she had valued it. Within 2 hours, the kitchen smelled like something a person would actually want to eat. Jacob was in the barn with Theodore's one full-time ranch hand, a lean Mexican cowboy named Esteban Ruiz, who had been with the Broken Spur for 4 years, and had apparently decided within 10 minutes of meeting Jacob that the boy was acceptable company. And Henrietta was standing at the stove feeling, for the first time in 6 months, something that was not actively despair. Dinner that evening was the first meal Henrietta had cooked for anyone other than herself and Jacob in longer than she wanted to admit. Theodore sat at the head of the table, Esteban across from Jacob, and the food disappeared with the focused appreciation of people who had been eating bachelor cooking for too long. "This is good," Esteban said, with the directness of someone for whom this was not a social nicety but a factual observation. He looked at Theodore. "Much better than yours." "Everything is much better than mine," Theodore said. He was looking at his plate, but there was something in the angle of his head that suggested he was aware of Henrietta in a way that was more than just courtesy. "Your stew was not terrible," Henrietta said, because she was honest but not needlessly unkind. "It was absolutely terrible," Theodore said. "But thank you." Jacob laughed, a real, sudden laugh that filled the room and surprised all of them, including Jacob himself, who looked briefly embarrassed and then decided it was acceptable. Henrietta looked at her son and felt the particular pain of watching her child laugh for the first time in months, knowing how much he had needed it. Esteban told Jacob about the Pinto mare, whose name was apparently Corazon, which Jacob thought was a wonderful name, and which Esteban said was misleading because the mare had no discernible heart where her behavior toward people was concerned. but she had tolerated Jacob's presence in her stall without attempting to bite him, which was a record. Theodore watched Jacob through all of this with the quiet, interested attention he gave to most things. And after dinner, when Jacob had fallen asleep, actually fallen asleep at the table, tilting sideways against the wall with his chin dropping toward his chest, Theodore helped Henrietta carry him to the back room without being asked, holding the boy with the careful competence of someone who understood that a sleeping child was a precious, fragile cargo. "He's a good boy," Theodore said when they had come back to the main room and Henrietta was washing the dishes. "He is," she said. "He's had a hard year. He hasn't complained once." "Where does he get that from?" Theodore said. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, not intrusive, not demanding, just present. "His father," she said. Then, after a moment, "and maybe a little from me." "I'd say mostly from you," Theodore said. He said it simply, as an observation, and then he pushed off the doorframe and said he would be up early for the morning work and that she should sleep as long as she needed, because she had walked a long way and the dishes would keep. "The dishes will not keep," she said. "But thank you." He smiled at that, actually smiled, and it changed his whole face, opened it up and made it younger and warmer and significantly more dangerous, Henrietta thought, to a woman who was trying very hard to keep her head level. She looked back at the dishes. "Good night, Mrs. Hale," he said. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said. She listened to his boots on the floorboards until they faded, and then she stood alone in the kitchen of this strange man's house, and thought that the day had been so long and so full of fear, and so unexpectedly not terrible at the end, that she was not entirely sure what to do with herself. She finished the dishes, dried them, set them on the shelf in exactly the order they had been in, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 6 months. The first weeks at the Broken Spur moved in a rhythm that Henrietta found herself falling into almost without realizing it. She rose before dawn, built the fire in the kitchen stove, started coffee and whatever was for breakfast, and had food on the table by the time Theodore and Esteban came in from the first morning check of the cattle. Jacob was always awake by then too, because Jacob, it turned out, had decided that he was going to earn his place at this ranch with every ounce of effort his 9-year-old body could produce. He hauled water from the well, he mucked out stalls. He learned to mend the simple sections of fence under Esteban's patient instruction, and Esteban, who had no children of his own and had long since given up expecting any, took to the boy with a gruff affection that expressed itself in the form of teaching him things: how to coil rope, how to read weather by the color of the horizon, how to tell a healthy cow from one that was starting to struggle, how to speak enough Spanish to make Corazon, who was apparently more responsive to Spanish than English, stand still for grooming. Theodore watched all of this and said little, but Henrietta noticed that he found reasons to be nearby when Jacob was working, not hovering, not intrusive, just present in the way that a man makes himself present when he wants to make sure a child is safe without making the child feel watched. For her own part, Henrietta cooked and cleaned and mended and gardened. There was a kitchen garden behind the main house that had been badly neglected, and she spent an entire week reclaiming it, pulling weeds that had gone woody and thick, turning the soil, replanting from the seed packets she found in a tin on the shelf with dates that were only 2 years old, which meant they were still good. She planted beans and squash and peppers, and she got a small stand of tomatoes going against the south-facing wall where the heat would help them. Theodore, coming around the corner of the house one evening and finding her on her hands and knees in the dirt, stopped and looked at the garden for a long moment. "I forgot that used to be a garden," he said. "It still is," she said, sitting back on her heels and pushing her hair out of her face. "It just forgot what it was for a while." He looked at her then in that particular way he had, the focused, assessing, genuinely interested look that was nothing like the way most men looked at women, which was either dismissive or acquisitive, neither of which had ever been any use to Henrietta. Theodore looked at her as if she were a thing he was trying to understand, not a thing he was trying to categorize. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," he said honestly. "Someone more desperate, maybe." "I am desperate," she said. "I just don't find it useful to advertise." He laughed at that, a genuine, full laugh that she had not heard from him before, and it was a good laugh, deep and unguarded, and it came and went quickly like a bird startled into flight, but while it was there it was wonderful. She looked down at her hands in the dirt to make sure she was not smiling like an idiot. "Can I help?" he said. She looked up. "Do you know anything about gardening?" "No," he said. "Then you can hand me seeds and try not to crush anything." He crouched down beside her in the dirt without a word, and they worked in comfortable near silence until the light was gone. There were two other men who came to the ranch for seasonal work, brothers named Cletus and Will Farmer, who arrived from Prescott in late spring with their gear and their horses and a general air of competent disinterest. They were not unkind, but they were not particularly warm either, and they regarded Henrietta with the careful neutrality of men who were not sure what she was doing there. This was fine with Henrietta, who was not there to be regarded. What was not fine, and what she noticed immediately, was that Cletus had a habit of speaking to Theodore about the ranch's needs in a way that involved a great deal of comment on what it cost to have extra mouths to feed. He did not say this to Henrietta directly. He said it to Theodore in her presence in a casual, sidelong way that was designed to seem like ordinary conversation. Theodore, to his credit, shut this down the second time it happened with such quiet, absolute finality that Cletus never raised it again. They had been at the dinner table, and Cletus had made a comment about provisions, and how the stores seemed to be going faster than expected, and Theodore had put down his fork and looked at Cletus with the flat, careful attention of a man who was about to say something that he intended to say only once. "The cooking in this house has improved considerably since Mrs. Hale arrived," Theodore said, "as has the state of the garden, the kitchen, the bunkhouse linens, and the general organization of the supply stores. The boy has been worth 2 hands of fence work. If you have a concern about provisions, Cletus, you can bring it to me privately, but I want to be clear that the Hales are here because I asked them to be, and they'll stay as long as they choose to." Cletus said, "Yes, sir," and went back to his food. Henrietta did not look at Theodore. She looked at her plate and felt something hot and fierce and grateful moving through her chest like a coal catching light. Later, when everyone had cleared out and she was tidying the kitchen and Theodore was at the table going over his ledger books, she said, without turning around, "Thank you for that." "It needed saying," he said. "It didn't have to be said the way it was," she said. She turned around. "You could have managed it without being so forthright." "I could have," he said. He was looking at the ledger. "But I didn't want to." She looked at him for a moment. "Why not?" He looked up at her then, and the directness of his gaze was startling, not aggressive, not searching, just entirely honest. "Because I meant it, and I thought you should hear it said out loud." She stood there for a moment, holding a damp cloth, not entirely sure what to do with herself. Then she turned back to the counter and said, "Your ledger has an addition error in the 3rd column." He looked down at the ledger. He was quiet for a moment. "So it does. You can read accounts." "My father was a bookkeeper in Philadelphia," she said. "I helped with his work from the time I was 12. "Philadelphia," he said, as if this explained something. "A long way from Arizona." "I met Robert at a dance in Missouri," she said. "He told me about the territory with so much conviction that I believed him. He was very convincing." "Do you regret it?" Theodore said. "Coming west?" She thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "I regret that he's gone, but the land itself, no. It's hard and it's strange and it's beautiful in a way I didn't understand when I first arrived, but no, I don't regret the land." Theodore looked at her for a long time after that, and she felt the weight of his attention like something physical, not unpleasant, just present and certain. "There's an error in every 3rd column," she said, because she needed to say something. "Your addition is fine, but you're writing some figures in the wrong column, so the totals are off." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ledger with the expression of a man who had suspected something was wrong for a while but had not had time to find it. "Could you look at it? Tomorrow," she said. "I'm going to bed. Good night, Mrs. Hale. Good night, Mr. Morgan." She was almost to the hallway when he said, "Henrietta." She stopped. "I'm glad you came to the gate," he said. She stood there with her back to him for a moment, and then she said, "So am I," and went to her room. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of the territory at night, coyotes in the distance, the low movement of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air. And she thought about a man who crouched down to talk to a 9-year-old boy at eye level and spoke to his hands, in defense of a woman he had known for 3 weeks, and had a laugh like something surprised into existence. And she told herself firmly that she was 31 years old and a widow, and she was not going to be foolish about this. She suspected, going to be foolish about this. The summer came in hard and blazing, the way Arizona summers did, without warning or mercy. The cattle needed constant checking for water, and the garden needed watering twice a day. And the inside of the house became a kind of heated sanctuary that Henrietta managed with open windows and wet cloths hung in the doorways to catch any moving air. She learned to do her outdoor work in the early morning and the late evening, and to respect the midday heat the way the land itself seemed to by going still and waiting. Jacob bloomed in the summer. He grew half an inch in 6 weeks, which Henrietta tracked by the notch she kept on the doorframe of his room, a habit from their life in Dusty Creek. His skin turned brown from the sun, and his dark eyes got brighter, and he learned to ride properly. Not just sitting on a mule, but actually ride, with Esteban teaching him the mechanics and Theodore supervising the first attempts with his hands loose at his sides, and his face doing the careful neutral thing that Henrietta now recognized as his version of holding his breath. The first time Jacob trotted Corazon around the corral without falling off, Theodore let out a slow breath and glanced at Henrietta, who was leaning on the fence rail beside him, and found that she was already looking at him. They looked at each other for a moment and then both looked back at Jacob, who was grinning so wide it seemed like it might hurt him. "He's a natural," Theodore said. "He is," Henrietta said. "He's also 9 years old and on a horse that tried to bite Esteban last week." "She's gentled up considerably," Theodore said. "You've been going to her stall in the evenings," Henrietta said. It was not a question. She had noticed him doing it, coming in from the day's work and stopping in the barn for 20 minutes before coming to the house for dinner. He looked at her with mild surprise that she had noticed. "How did you know?" "Because Corazon's behavior improved after the 3rd week, and the only thing that changed was you going to the barn at that particular time," she said. "I pay attention." "I've noticed that about you," he said. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. "It's one of the better things," he said, and she felt her heart do something unreasonable, and she looked back at the corral. The ledger situation had become something that brought them together every Sunday evening. Henrietta had gone through the accounts books and found the errors, not dishonesty, just the accumulated mistakes of a man who was excellent at ranching and adequate at arithmetic, and had begun keeping the accounts herself, which meant that once a week they sat together at the table while she went through the week's figures, and he explained what each line referred to. It had the structure of a practical arrangement and the feeling of something else entirely, because they sat close enough that she could smell the particular clean scent of the soap he used, and he had a habit of leaning over to look at a figure she was pointing to that brought him near enough that she was very aware of where his shoulder was in relation to her shoulder. They talked during these sessions, in the way that people talk when they have been given a legitimate excuse to be near each other, and are taking full advantage of it while pretending they are just doing accounts. They talked about the cattle market, which Theodore followed with the attention of someone who had made his entire life out of understanding it. They talked about Jacob, who had become a topic that both of them returned to with the ease of people for whom a child has become a shared interest. They talked about books Theodore's reading was wide and serious. history and natural philosophy, and a great deal of practical agriculture. And Henrietta had a taste for novels that she had never quite lost from her Philadelphia childhood, and they argued pleasantly about whether fiction was a useful use of time, an argument Theodore lost badly, because he made the mistake of claiming he had never read any novels, and Henrietta produced a dog-eared copy of a Dickens novel from her satchel, one of the 2 books she had carried from Dusty Creek, and told him he was going to read it. He read it. It took him 2 weeks, reading in the evenings after the ledger session, and when he finished it he pushed it back across the table to her and said, "I was wrong, it is useful." Then he paused and said, "It was very good." "It was very good," she agreed. "Which one do you want next?" "You only have 2, he said. "I can write to the dry goods store in Tucson," she said. "They carry some, I've done it before." He looked at her. "You've been ordering books." "I ordered 2 for myself," she said. "But I can include one for you in the next letter if you tell me what you would like." He thought about this with the focused consideration he gave to most things. "Something about history," he said. "Real history, not battles. People," she said. "Yes," he said, "people." She found him a biography of Benjamin Franklin, which arrived 6 weeks later along with her own order, and the evening she presented it to him, he looked at the cover for a moment and then looked at her and said, "Thank you, Henrietta." And there was something in the way he said her name fully, with attention, as if her name were a thing worth saying properly, that made her breath catch in a way she had not experienced since she was 17 years old and Robert Hale had asked her to dance. She told herself to be sensible. She was not entirely successful. It was Esteban who brought it out into the open, which was either very brave or very foolish depending on how you looked at it. He was not a man who minced words, Esteban, and he had apparently been watching Theodore and Henrietta circle each other for 2 months, with the patience of a man who had seen enough of life to know how these things went but not quite enough to stop himself from commenting. He came to Henrietta in the garden one afternoon in August, when she was staking up the tomatoes that had gotten tall and was alone for once, and he leaned on the fence post and looked at her with his hat in his hands. "He's a good man," Esteban said. "Theodore, he is a very good man." Henrietta kept working on the tomato stakes. "I know," she said. "He is also a very stubborn man," Esteban said. "He will not say a thing that he thinks will make a woman uncomfortable. He has decided it would not be respectful to say certain things to you, because you have not been widowed a full year yet, and he thinks—" Esteban paused, looking for the right words. "He thinks that you are still grieving and he does not want to press." Henrietta straightened up and looked at Esteban. "He told you this?" "No," Esteban said. "He told me about his cattle count, but I have known him for 4 years, and I know what he sounds like when he is saying one thing and meaning something else." He looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to go all the way. "I am telling you this because I think you are also very stubborn, and also because you are both very unhappy in the way that people are unhappy when they want something they think they cannot have, and I find it tiresome." Henrietta stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "Esteban, this is really none of your business." "No," he agreed, "but I am doing it anyway." She looked back at her tomatoes. "I am still grieving," she said. "Robert was a good man and I loved him, and he is not a year gone, and it is not a simple thing." "No," Esteban said, "nothing is a simple thing. But grief and the present time can exist together. I think you know this." She did know this. Grief and the present time had been existing together in her chest since the day she walked into the broken spur. They were neighbors, her love for what she had lost and her awareness of what was standing in front of her, and they were uncomfortable neighbors, but they had managed not to destroy each other. "Go look after your cattle," she said to Esteban. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked away. She thought about it for 3 days, and on the 3rd day she found Theodore alone in the barn in the late afternoon, doing the kind of methodical harness repair that a man does when he needs something to do with his hands. She had come to bring him the Sunday ledger, but she put it down on the workbench beside him and stood there for a moment. "Esteban says you're being careful with me because you think I'm still fully in the middle of grieving," she said. Theodore's hands went still on the harness. He did not look up immediately. "Esteban talks too much," he said. "He does," she agreed, "but he's not wrong." Theodore put the harness down and turned to face her. In the golden afternoon light of the barn, with the sound of the horses moving quietly in their stalls, he looked not uncertain. Theodore Morgan was not a man who was uncertain about most things, but he looked like a man who had been very carefully holding a thing in both hands for a long time and was not entirely sure what to do if he set it down. "You have not been here a full year," he said. "No," she said. "I've been here 4 months." "Your husband has been gone, my husband has been gone long enough," she said, and her voice was gentle but completely clear. "I loved Robert. I will always love Robert. He was the father of my son and a good man, and his death was a genuine loss, and I will carry that with me. That is true. But it is also true that I have been standing in your kitchen for 4 months, and that your laugh is one of my favorite sounds, and that I sleep better in this house than I have since I can remember." And she stopped. She looked at him. "I am 31 years old, and I have been cold for a long time, Theodore, and I am very tired of being cold." He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was quiet. Corazon shifted in her stall with a soft sound of hooves on straw. "Henrietta," he said. He said her name the way he always said it, fully, with attention, and then he crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for 4 months and had decided that if he was going to do it, he was going to mean it. And he did mean it, entirely, with everything he had. His hands were careful and warm against her face, and she felt the scratch of his beard and the warmth of him, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding so carefully and for so long. And when they finally pulled apart, she found that she was gripping the front of his shirt in both fists. She looked up at him. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before, not guarded, not careful, just entirely present and clear. "I have been wanting to do that since about the 2nd week," he said. "Only the 2nd week," she said. "I'm offended." He laughed, and it was the full laugh, the unguarded one, and she felt it resonate through her chest where her hands were still holding his shirt. They were careful after that, because Jacob was there and he was a perceptive child, and because Henrietta wanted to be thoughtful about how things unfolded. She talked to Jacob herself, on a warm September evening when they were sitting together on the porch steps after dinner watching the stars come out over the desert. She told him that she liked Theodore very much. She told him that things might change. She told him that nothing that changed would ever change what he was to her or what his father had been. Jacob listened to all of this with the serious attention of a child who understood that he was being treated as someone whose feelings mattered. "Do you like him?" Henrietta asked. Jacob thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most things. "He helped me learn to ride Corazon," he said, "and he doesn't talk down to me, and he has a lot of good books." "Those are all true," Henrietta said. "I think Papa would think he was a good man," Jacob said. And then, in the way of children who have thought about something more carefully than adults give them credit for, "I think Papa would want you to not be so sad all the time. Even when you're happy, I can tell you're sad." Henrietta put her arm around her son and held him very tightly and looked at the stars until she trusted herself to speak. "I love you," she said. "I know," Jacob said. "Can we go inside? There are mosquitoes." They went inside. The autumn at the Broken Spur was the most beautiful season Henrietta had ever seen in Arizona. The brutal heat broke in October, and the desert took on a gentler quality. The light came in at a lower angle and turned everything gold and amber, and the garden she had planted in the spring was producing abundantly, which gave her a satisfaction that was almost physical. The tomatoes had come in red and heavy, and she had put up 40 jars of preserves and sauce, and the chili pepper harvest was drying in long red strings in the kitchen window. Theodore and Henrietta took to walking in the evenings after Jacob was in bed, not long walks, just out from the house and into the cooling air, moving along the fence line or up the small rise to the east where you could see the lights of the distant settlement, and beyond them the black shape of the mountain range against the darker sky. They talked on these walks in the slow, comfortable way of people who have decided they like each other's company and are no longer anxious about filling silence. They told each other the things you tell someone when you have decided they are worth telling. Theodore had grown up in Kansas, the second son of a farming family, and had come to the territory at 22 with $200 and the kind of conviction that young men have when they have decided that their future is somewhere other than where they started. He had bought the original parcel of the Broken Spur land at 24 with money he had earned from 3 years of working another man's cattle, and he had built the central room of the main house himself, which explained why the walls were thick and the ceiling was low. He had overestimated how much height he needed and underestimated how much warmth he would want in winter. He told her about the marriage to Clara, not bitterly, but fully about the woman who had come to the territory with romantic ideas about the frontier that the reality had ground down season by season, until there was nothing left but her unhappiness and his guilt at not being able to give her something different, and the relief and the loneliness of watching the stage take her away in the spring of 1875. "Did you love her?" Henrietta asked. "I thought I did," he said. "When I was young enough to confuse certainty with love, I thought she was what I wanted. She was beautiful and very sure of herself, and I confused that for depth." He paused. "I don't think I knew what love actually felt like until," he stopped. "Until," she said. He looked at her. The moon was up and the light was silver and clear and his face was entirely visible and entirely honest. "Until I started watching you walk into the barn to tell Jacob dinner was ready," he said. "It's a very specific moment." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "That's a very specific example," she said. "I'm a specific person," he said. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and they stood there in the moonlit desert for a moment that felt like something she wanted to keep. "Theodore," she said, "what are we doing?" "I know what I would like to be doing," he said carefully, "but I don't want to move faster than you're comfortable with." "What would you like to be doing?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. Not because of practicality or because it makes sense, although it does both of those things, but because this is the most alive I have felt in a very long time, and that seems like a reason." She was quiet for a moment. The desert breathed around them, the smell of sage and cooling earth and the distant cattle. "That is a very Theodore Morgan way of proposing," she said. "Is that a yes?" he said. "I want to ask you something first," she said. "Are you asking because you genuinely want this? Not because it would be convenient, or because Jacob is here and you feel—" "Henrietta," he said, "I asked you because when you told me about your father being a bookkeeper in Philadelphia, and you were 12 years old and helping with his accounts, I thought that was one of the most interesting things I had ever heard, and I wanted to know every other thing about you. I asked because you replanted my garden and fixed my ledgers, and told me my stew was terrible in a way that was completely honest and somehow also kind. I asked because Jacob laughed at that dinner table for the first time in months, and it was because you were there, and watching that felt like something I wanted to see every day. I asked because I love you and I know that it's only been 4 months and you can say no and I will respect it absolutely, but those are my reasons and they are not practical." She looked at him for a long moment in the moonlight. "Yes," she said. He breathed out slowly. Then he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was so courtly and unexpected from this large, practical, weathered man that she laughed. "Now can we go inside?" she said. "It is cold." "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is." They told Jacob together the next morning. They sat him down after breakfast and Theodore said that he wanted to ask Jacob something important, and Jacob looked at both of them with the calm attention of a child who had already, in some instinctive way, understood what was coming. Theodore said, "I've asked your mother to marry me and she has said yes, but I want to ask you too because you are part of this and your answer matters. How do you feel about it?" Jacob thought about it. He looked at Theodore with very serious dark eyes. Then he said, "If I say no, will you stop making me muck out stalls?" Theodore blinked. Then a slow smile crossed his face. Nice try. It was worth asking, Jacob said, then dropping the performance. I think it's good. I think you're good for her. She smiles more. He paused. And you're good for me too, even if you won't let me skip the stalls. Theodore put his hand on Jacob's shoulder briefly, firmly. Jacob leaned into it for just a second before straightening back up. They were married in late November of 1878, in the parlor of the main house, with a traveling minister who came through the territory every 6 weeks on a circuit that covered 4 counties. Esteban stood beside Theodore with the air of a man who was deeply satisfied with an outcome he had personally facilitated, though he was too dignified to say so. The farmer brothers attended and behaved well. There was a woman from the nearest settlement, a wide, forthright woman named Agnes Boone, who had become something of an acquaintance of Henrietta's from the monthly supply runs into town, who sat in the front of the room and cried unreservedly. Jacob wore his good shirt and stood beside his mother, and gave her away with a gravity that made the minister clear his throat against an emotion he was apparently not expecting. Theodore wore a clean white shirt and his least battered hat, and he looked at Henrietta when she walked into the parlor, in her best dress, which was deep blue wool, and which she had pressed carefully the night before with an expression that was not the careful, guarded look she had first known from him, but something entirely open and certain and warm. And she thought, walking toward him, that the world was a very strange and sometimes generous place. That 6 miles of red dust and a cracked leather satchel and a 9-year-old boy had brought her to this particular man in this particular room on this particular winter morning. The minister said the words. They said the words back. Theodore slid a ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold that had belonged to his grandmother, which he had kept in a tobacco tin in the back of a drawer for 11 years, and when he kissed her, the room produced a sound that was somewhere between applause and laughter and tears. Agnes Boone wept loudly and entirely without shame. Esteban looked at the ceiling with an expression of controlled emotion. Jacob made a face that meant he was feeling something large and did not want to be caught feeling it. That evening, with Jacob asleep and the house quiet and the first real cold of winter pressing against the windows, Theodore and Henrietta sat together at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the Sunday ledger between them like an old friend. "We should talk about the spring planting," Theodore said. "We should," she agreed. "And the cattle count needs to be reconciled by January," he said. "It does," she said. They looked at each other over the ledger and the coffee cups. "We just got married," she said. "We did," he said. "And we're talking about cattle," she said. "Is that wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "It's completely right, actually. It's exactly right." She put her hand on the table and he covered it with his. "I just want to note that I am very happy." "So am I," he said. "For the record." "For the ledger," she said. He laughed. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a settling time, not quiet, because a working ranch is never quiet, but settled in the way that a house feels when everyone in it is where they are supposed to be. Henrietta learned the rhythms of the broken spur at depth, not just the surface rhythms of cooking and cleaning, but the deeper ones. The way the cattle moved differently in cold weather and needed extra checking. The way the well froze twice and Theodore and Esteban spent half a morning with hot water getting it functional again. The way the bunkhouse stove threw off enough heat for 3 men, but not quite 4. So the farmer brothers had found a system of sleeping shifts that Henrietta found both ingenious and slightly alarming. She and Theodore were figuring out how to share a life, which was different from sharing a house. They had been sharing the house for 4 months before the wedding, and that had established a working relationship of the most practical kind. But marriage was different. It was the agreement to share the interior of things, the parts that were not about cooking schedules and account books, and this required a different kind of attention. Theodore was not a man who talked easily about what he was feeling. This was not because he was not feeling things. Henrietta had learned quickly that he felt things quite deeply, but because he had spent a long time in the habit of managing his interior life alone, and habits that long were not broken easily. She did not try to break it. She learned to read him in other ways. The way he moved when he was worried about something, the particular quality of his silence when something was heavy on him, the way he found small, physical reasons to be near her when he needed reassurance without being able to ask for it. She, in turn, was learning that she did not have to manage everything alone anymore, which was a harder lesson than it should have been. She had been managing alone for so long. Even before Robert died, there had been a quality of solitary management to her life, because Robert was a good man but not a particularly observant one, and she had learned to handle most things herself rather than explain what needed handling. Theodore was observant in a way that was almost startling. He noticed things, and he showed up, and she had to practice letting him show up instead of saying she was fine when she was not. On a cold February evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, going through a letter from her sister in Missouri, her only living relative, a woman named Margaret who had married a dry goods merchant and was comfortable and kind, and worried about Henrietta from a distance. And she started crying without entirely meaning to, because the letter contained news that their mother had passed in the autumn, quietly, in her sleep. And Margaret had not wanted to send bad news over Christmas, and so had held it until February. And the news hit Henrietta sideways, because she had been steeling herself against so many things, and this one caught her unprepared. Theodore came in from the barn, stamped the cold from his boots, and stopped when he saw her. He did not ask what was wrong. He pulled his chair around the table to sit beside her and put his arm around her, and she pressed her face into the warmth of his shoulder and cried properly, the way she had not allowed herself to cry since Robert's fever, and he held her without saying anything unhelpful for a long time, and eventually said very quietly, "Tell me about her." And Henrietta told him about her mother, a small, fierce woman from a Philadelphia family who had married a bookkeeper against her own family's wishes and never once expressed regret, who had taught Henrietta to read at 4 and to stand straight at 5 and to say what she meant at 6, who had cried when Henrietta left for Missouri and said only, "Write me letters, long ones, and don't let anyone tell you that you are ordinary because you are not." And she had written letters, long ones, for 15 years, and she would not write any more. Theodore listened to all of it, and when she was finished he said, "She sounds like someone who would have liked this ranch." Henrietta laughed, surprised through the last of the tears. She absolutely would not have. She would have been appalled by the heat. But she would have liked the people in it, he said. Henrietta considered this. "Yes," she said, "she would have liked you." "I'm glad," he said, and held her a little tighter. Spring came back to the broken spur with green pushing up through the red earth, and with it came new calves and the need to expand the herd, which meant a trip to the cattle auction in Tucson that Theodore and Esteban made in late March, leaving the ranch in the care of the farmer brothers and Henrietta, who managed it with the quiet competence that had become her established mode by this point. While Theodore was gone, Henrietta had a conversation with Cletus Farmer that went differently than any conversation she had previously had with him. He came to the kitchen in the morning for his coffee, and he stood there with it for a moment and said awkwardly, as if the words were unfamiliar in his mouth, "You run this place good, Mrs. Morgan." She looked at him. "Thank you, Cletus." "I wasn't at the start," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I wasn't fair about the situation when you first came." "No," she said. "You weren't." He nodded, accepting this. "I was wrong about it. What you've done with this place, the kitchen and the garden and the accounts, Theodore's ranch is better. That's just true." "It's our ranch," she said gently. Not a correction, just a fact. He looked at her and nodded again. "Yes, ma'am, our ranch." He took his coffee and went back to the fence work. Henrietta looked out the kitchen window at the greening pasture and thought that the territory was a hard place, but occasionally it surprised you. Theodore came back from Tucson with 14 new calves and a length of green ribbon from the dry goods store, which he produced from his saddlebag with a studied casualness that did not fool Henrietta for a single second. "I noticed you had been tying back your hair with a piece of string," he said. She took the ribbon and looked at it. It was exactly the right shade of green. You noticed what color ribbon I would like. I notice things, he said. She looked at him. He was dusty from the road and tired from 3 days of auction, and he was holding out a piece of green ribbon with the careful attention of a man who had been thinking about it for 3 days. And she thought that she was going to say something that expressed how much this particular thing meant to her. But she could not find the words, so instead she stood up on her toes and kissed him properly, right there in the yard with Esteban 20 feet away pretending to examine a bridle very closely. Good trip, she said when she stepped back. Better now, he said. Summer arrived, and with it a complication that Henrietta handled with her characteristic combination of directness and calm, though it was not nothing. She had begun to suspect in June and confirmed in July that she was expecting a child. She told Theodore on a Sunday evening after the ledger session, after Jacob was in bed when the house was quiet. She said it plainly because she knew no other way. I believe I'm pregnant, she said. I'm certain enough to be telling you. Theodore looked at her for a very long moment. His expression moved through several things she could watch but not entirely catalog, and then it settled into something she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and wide open and deeply glad. Are you well? He said. I'm perfectly well, she said. I've done this before, I know what to do. I don't, he said. I will need to be told. I know you will, she said. I'll tell you. He got up from the table and came around to her and took her face in his hands the way he had in the barn on that October afternoon, and he looked at her with everything he had and said, Henrietta Morgan, you are remarkable. I am pregnant and I have been nauseous for 2 weeks, she said. I'm not feeling particularly remarkable. You are, he said, permanently, with or without the nausea. She put her hands over his. Are you happy? Considerably, he said. She smiled. Then so am I. Jacob took the news of an incoming sibling with the gravity of someone who has considered all possible implications. His primary concern, he said, was whether the baby was going to be loud because he needed to sleep. Theodore told him that babies were historically loud, and there was no getting around it. Jacob accepted this with the stoicism of someone who had accepted harder truths. Esteban produced from somewhere in the depths of the bunkhouse a cradle that he had apparently made over the winter from spare timber on the grounds, he said, that he had thought it was a reasonable probability. He presented it to Henrietta with a dignity that suggested he had given this a lot of thought. You made this, she said. Over 6 weeks, he said. The joints are very good. They are, she said, running her hand over the smooth wood. Esteban, this is beautiful. He accepted this with the measured satisfaction of someone who had done a thing well and knew it. The baby should have something proper, he said. The baby is very lucky to have you, Henrietta said. Esteban looked mildly embarrassed and retreated to the barn. The pregnancy progressed through the summer heat and into the merciful cool of the Arizona autumn, and Theodore hovered in the way of a man who is very worried about someone and is trying not to make them feel hovered over, which meant that he found a great many reasons to be in or near the house without acknowledging that he was watching over her. Henrietta let him do it because she understood it, and because it was, in its way, deeply sweet. She had found a doctor who visited the settlement from Tucson every 2 months, a man named Dr. Whitfield, who was capable and practical and examined her thoroughly and said she was healthy and strong, and there was no cause for concern. Theodore attended this appointment with Henrietta, sitting in the waiting area of the settlement's small medical office with his hat in his hands in the posture of a man enduring something he finds very difficult by sheer force of will. When Dr. Whitfield came out and told him that mother and child appeared to be in excellent health, Theodore shook the man's hand so firmly that Whitfield looked slightly startled. On a cold night in late January of 1880, with the temperature outside below freezing and the stove in the bedroom burning hot, and Esteban sent to the settlement to get the local midwife, a practical woman named Dolores Reyes, who arrived with a bag full of implements, and the focused authority of someone who had done this many times, Henrietta brought a boy into the world. He was large and loud and entirely healthy, and he announced his arrival with such volume that Jacob, who had been told to stay in his room, immediately appeared in the doorway looking both alarmed and fascinated. And Esteban, who had returned with dolers and been waiting in the main room, let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for approximately 3 hours. Theodore was in the room because Henrietta had told him he was going to be in the room and there was no negotiation available, and he had held her hand through all of it and been as useful as a man can be in that situation, which is to say moderately useful and predominantly emotionally overwhelmed, in a way he was managing with considerable effort. When Dolers put the baby in his arms, he stood very still and looked down at the small red face with an expression that Henrietta, exhausted and relieved and watching him from the pillow, would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," Theodore said, very quietly to the baby, as if introducing himself. As if the baby were a person he had been very much looking forward to meeting. "He needs a name," Henrietta said. Theodore looked up. "What do you want?" "I was thinking Robert," she said, "for his grandfather, if you agree." Theodore looked back at the baby, then at Henrietta. "Robert Morgan," he said. "Yes." Jacob appeared in the doorway again, and this time Theodore looked over and said, "Come and meet your brother." And Jacob came cautiously into the room and stood beside his stepfather and looked at the small, red, indignant face of Robert Morgan and said, "He really is loud." "He is," Theodore agreed. "He gets that from your mother." Henrietta said, "I am right here." And both of them looked at her with identical expressions of mild innocence that were so similar, Jacob having absorbed, in 14 months at the Broken Spur, a great deal of Theodore Morgan's mannerisms, that she started laughing, which hurt, but was worth it. The years settled in around the Broken Spur like the dust settled after a long ride, softly, comprehensively, covering every surface. Robert grew from a loud red newborn into a loud, cheerful toddler who followed Jacob everywhere with the devoted intensity of a small dog. And Jacob, who had worried about the noise, turned out to be a tender and patient older brother of the most unexpected variety. He taught Robert things the way Esteban had taught him, seriously, with explanations, with the expectation that the smaller person could handle real information if you gave it to them straight. The garden expanded. Henrietta added a second bed of vegetables and a small herb garden along the fence, and she began selling preserves and dried goods to Agnes Boone's husband, who had a small store in the settlement. And what started as a modest extra income became, within 2 years, a reliable contribution to the ranch's accounts. Theodore expanded the herd successfully. The 1880 and 1881 cattle markets were good, and the Broken Spur's reputation for solid, healthy animals built gradually into a name that meant something at the Tucson auction. He took on 2 more permanent hands, young men from the settlement named Pete Carson and Raphael Domings, both of whom Esteban assessed with the authority of senior ranking and found acceptable. In the spring of 1882, Jacob, who had turned 13 and had by this point been doing legitimate ranch work for 3 years, came to Theodore and Henrietta with the kind of serious, prepared air that meant he had been thinking about something for a while. "I want to be a rancher," he said. "Not always working for someone else. I want to learn everything about running a place." Theodore looked at the boy, no, the young man, because he was growing into that, and nodded slowly. "Then we start properly," he said. "From the accounting to the breeding decisions to the land management, all of it." "I can teach the accounts," Henrietta said. "I already have been." "I know the accounts," Jacob said with the mild impatience of someone who has been doing a thing for years. "I want to know the cattle side, the decisions." Theodore stood up from the table. "Come on then," he said. "We'll start this afternoon." Henrietta watched them walk out together, the tall man and the growing boy, and she felt the particular piercing sweetness of a moment that was exactly what it was supposed to be, nothing more and nothing less. The summer of 1882 brought a dry spell that worried everyone in the territory, the cattle ranchers most of all, because grass withered and water sources dropped, and the cost of keeping a herd healthy went up while the market prices stayed uncertain. Theodore managed it carefully, moving the cattle to the northern pasture where a seasonal creek still ran, cutting the herd by selling 20 head early before the prices could drop further, and rationing the well water with the focused attention of a man who understood that water in Arizona was not a convenience but a survival. It was hard. Henrietta stretched every provision and every resource with the practiced efficiency she had developed over years of managing on limited means, and the household ran lean without running empty. She did not complain, and neither did anyone else, and by September, when the rains finally came and the grass began recovering, Theodore sat at the kitchen table and looked at the ledger and said, "We came through it." "We did," she said. "Your garden savings helped," he said. "The cattle decisions helped," she said. He looked at her across the table. "I couldn't have done this alone," he said, not as flattery, just as a statement of what he believed was true. "I know," she said. "Neither could I." She reached across the table and he took her hand. "That's rather the point." He turned her hand over and looked at it, the ring, the calluses from garden work, the ink stain on her right finger from the ledger pen, and he pressed his lips to her palm in that gesture that was still, after 4 years of marriage, capable of doing something unreasonable to her pulse. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said, "very considerably." "I love you too," she said. "Very considerably, and with full awareness of all your ledger errors." "You have been holding those over me for 4 years," he said. "I will hold them over you for 40 more," she said. He smiled, the full, warm, unguarded smile that she had first seen on that early evening in the kitchen, and that had been, she could admit now, one of the moments she had known with some certainty how this was going to go. "Good," he said. Robert was 3 years old and in possession of views about most subjects, which he expressed freely. He had his father's directness and his mother's stubbornness and Jacob's tendency to state things plainly regardless of the social consequences. And Theodore handled all of this with the patience of a man who found it more amusing than alarming. Robert had, by age 3, declared that Esteban was his best friend, which Esteban received with a dignity that did not entirely conceal his pleasure, and had begun making statements about horses that were remarkably accurate for someone who was not yet tall enough to look over a fence rail without standing on a fence post. "He's going to be a horseman," Esteban said, watching Robert very seriously explain to Corazon why she needed to hold still. "He's going to be a handful," Theodore said. "Those are sometimes the same thing," Esteban said. Christmas of 1882 was the first Christmas that Henrietta allowed herself to feel was fully, completely, wholeheartedly hers. Not a thing she was managing, not a celebration she was producing for others while remaining slightly outside it, but something she was genuinely inside. She cooked for 2 days, with Agnes Boone coming to help and the two of them filling the kitchen with the smell of pies and roasted meat and corn bread. And on Christmas morning there was a tree. Theodore had ridden into the hills above the settlement and come back with a juniper that was not quite the right shape, but was fragrant and real. And Jacob had made paper decorations with Robert's enthusiastic if imprecise assistance. And Theodore had produced from somewhere a small jar of hard candy that Robert received with a reverence that suggested it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. That evening, with Robert asleep holding his candy jar and Jacob reading by the fire and Esteban gone to the settlement for the night, Henrietta and Theodore stood on the porch in the cold, clear Christmas air with their shoulders touching, looking at the stars. "Tell me something," Henrietta said. "What would you like to know?" he said. "Tell me something you haven't told me yet," she said. He thought about it. "When you first came to the gate," he said, "with Jacob. I watched you walking up the road and I thought, I don't know exactly what I thought, that you were the most determined person I had ever seen. And that you were frightened but you were not going to show it, and that was something I understood." She was quiet. "I was frightened too," he said. "Not of you, of the gap between what I had and what I wanted. I had made myself comfortable with what I had. You walking up that road made me remember what I wanted." She took his hand. "What did you want?" "This," he said simply. "Exactly this." She leaned against him and felt the solid warmth of him and the cold of the Arizona winter, and the sound of the settlement's distant bells ringing for the Christmas evening service. And she thought about a morning 4 years ago when she had walked through red dust with a cracked satchel and a 9-year-old boy, and knocked on a stranger's gate and asked only if her son could work. He had said they both could stay. She had not known then that staying would mean this. That it would mean a man who read her books and fixed her mother's letters into his memory and made her laugh on the worst days, and looked at their son with an expression of pure gladness, and stood beside her in the hardest of the territory's seasons with the immovable certainty of someone who had decided and was not going to undecide. She had not known it would mean home, but it did. It meant exactly that. In the early spring of 1883, Henrietta confirmed what she had suspected since February. She was expecting again. She told Theodore in the same kitchen, on the same evening, in the same direct way. "Again," she said. He looked at her with the same expression as before, the wide, glad, open one. "Again," he agreed. "How are you feeling?" "Less nauseous this time," she said, "which is a considerable improvement." He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her for a long moment, one hand in her hair and his face pressed to the top of her head, and she felt his chest rise and fall in the slow, certain rhythm that she had learned was his content rhythm, his settled rhythm, the breathing of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. "What do you want?" she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "A healthy mother," he said immediately. "Everything else is secondary." "After that," she said. "After that," he said, "I'll take whatever comes." What came in November of 1883 was a daughter. She arrived with considerably less fanfare than Robert had, quieter, more deliberate, looking around at the world with an expression of serious appraisal that made Dolores Ray's laugh, and say she had never seen a newborn who looked so like she was deciding whether the whole situation was acceptable. They named her Clara Louise Morgan. The Clara not for Theodore's first wife, but for a graytan of Henrietta's who had been a schoolteacher in Baltimore for 40 years, and had never, as far as anyone knew, done a thing she didn't mean to do. Robert, at 3.5, regarded his sister with the focused consideration of someone working out the implications. "Is she going to ride horses?" he asked. "Eventually," Theodore said. "Good," Robert said, apparently satisfied. Jacob, at 14, was so thoroughly charmed by his baby sister that Esteban found him sitting in the rocking chair in the kitchen at 6 in the morning holding her while she slept, the two of them in the firelight like a painting, and Esteban retreated without waking them and told Theodore, who said nothing but whose expression said everything. The Broken Spur in 1884 was a different place from the struggling, bachelor-kept ranch that Henrietta had walked into 6 years earlier. The main house had been extended again. Theodore and Esteban and Pete Carson had spent the late spring building an additional room off the east side for the children, a proper room with a window that caught the morning light and bunk frames that Jacob and Theodore had built from good lumber ordered from Tucson. The kitchen had a new, better stove that drew properly and did not smoke in easterly wind. The garden was the envy of every woman in the settlement who had seen it, and several of them had come to Henrietta for advice, and she had given it freely and precisely, because she was her father's daughter and liked to see a thing done correctly. The ranch hands were a settled crew, now Esteban as permanent and essential as the land itself, Pete Carson and Raphael Domings as reliable second years, and a new young hand named Tom Briggs who was 17 and had come from New Mexico with a good recommendation and a willingness to learn. Jacob, at 15, had more knowledge of cattle management than Tom, which Tom accepted with grace because Jacob had the sense to teach without condescension. Theodore and Henrietta had built, without deciding to build it, the kind of partnership that looks from the outside like simply a good marriage, but is actually a thing constructed out of 1,000 small choices. The choice to be honest when lying would be easier. The choice to show up when absence would be simpler. The choice to say I love you even on the days when love is not the exciting, trembling thing it was in the beginning, but the deep, load-bearing thing it becomes. The thing that holds the weight of everything else. They argued occasionally, because they were both honest people with strong opinions, and honest people with strong opinions argue. They argued about money and decisions, and once, memorably, about whether the south fence needed replacing entirely or just patching. A dispute that lasted 3 days and was settled by Esteban's diplomatic suggestion that they replace half and patch the other half, which both of them had to admit was the correct answer. After arguments, Theodore went quiet for a while and then came back and said what he actually meant, which was usually not what he had said during the argument. Henrietta went quiet too, briefly, and then said what she actually felt, which was sometimes the same as what she had said during the argument but always more clearly. They were good at this. It had taken practice, but they were good at it. On a spring morning in 1885, Henrietta was in the garden with Clara on a blanket in the sun, and Robert racing around the perimeter of the fence in the private game that made sense only to himself, when Jacob came to find her. He was 16 now, nearly Theodore's height, and he walked with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up doing real work and knew the value of what he could do. He sat down on the garden fence and looked at his mother. "I've been thinking," he said. She said. "About what I want," he said. "You asked me once when I was 9 and we were walking to this ranch what I would do if we didn't find work. Do you remember?" She did remember. She had asked him to distract them both from the fear. He had said very seriously that he supposed they would figure something out. "I remember," she said. "I think about that a lot," he said. "That we figured something out." She looked at her son. "We did," she said. "I want to do something with that," he said. "I want to take the things I learned here, the cattle, the land management, the accounts, and eventually, when I'm ready and when I've earned enough, I want to start my own place. Small to start, but mine." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment. "That is a good thing to want," she said. "Theodore said he would help me," Jacob said. "He said he already set aside some cattle from last year's crop that can start a breeding stock when I'm ready." He said it quietly, like he didn't want me to make a big thing of it. Henrietta felt the back of her throat tighten in the way that happened when Theodore did something that she had not anticipated and that went straight past every defense she had. "He did that," she said. "He's been planning it for a while, I think," Jacob said. "He's not good at saying things directly sometimes." "No," she said, "but he is very good at doing them." Jacob smiled Robert's smile with his father's eyes. "I know," he said. "I learned that from him." She reached over the fence rail and put her hand on his arm for a moment. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said. "I know," he said, "and I think he'd like Theodore." "He would," she said, "very much." That evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Henrietta found Theodore on the porch with his coffee, watching the stars come out over the desert the way he did most evenings. She sat beside him and was quiet for a while. "You set aside cattle for Jacob," she said, a pause. "He told you." "He did," she said. Theodore looked at the stars. "He's earned it," he said. "He's worked this ranch like it was his for 5 years. It's right that he has a start." "Theodore," she said. "It's not a grand gesture," he said preemptively, because he knew what she was going to say and was uncomfortable with the emotional weight of it. "It's a practical arrangement." "Theodore," she said again. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then put his arm around her and she leaned against him. And they sat like that in the cooling desert evening with the stars coming up one by one over the mountain range, and the cattle settling for the night, and the sound of Robert talking in his sleep through the bedroom window and Clara's quiet breathing, and the land around them patient and ancient and indifferent to them in the beautiful way that the desert is indifferent. It does not care whether you love it or fear it, whether you survive or fail. But if you stay and you work and you pay attention, it gives you something that nothing else does. The deep, particular satisfaction of a life built by hand, with purpose, on ground you have earned. Henrietta Morgan had not earned this ground with money. She had earned it with 6 miles of red dust, and a cracked leather satchel and a 9-year-old boy, and the particular kind of courage that is not the dramatic, single-moment kind but the daily, ordinary, relentless kind. The courage of getting up every day and doing the next necessary thing, and the next, and the next, until the next necessary thing turns out to be something you could not have imagined when you started. She had not imagined Theodore Morgan. She had not imagined the garden or the books or the Sunday evenings with the ledger or the sound of his laugh in the kitchen. She had not imagined Robert, sleeping with his candy jar on Christmas morning, or Clara, regarding the world with her great-great-aunt's practical eyes, or Jacob growing into the man that he was going to be, solid and thoughtful and capable and kind. She had walked to a gate in the territory and asked if her son could work. He had said they both could stay. She had not known then that staying was the most extraordinary thing she had ever done. She knew it now. The years that followed were good years, the kind of years that build on each other quietly and become a life. Jacob, at 19, left the Broken Spur with Theodore's breeding cattle and Esteban's blessing and Henrietta's full pantry of preserves, and started his own small ranch 12 miles east, on land he had been quietly saving for since he was 15. He was close enough to come for Sunday dinners and far enough that he was his own man, and this was exactly right, and everyone understood that it was right, which made the leaving less like a loss and more like an accomplishment. Robert grew into the horseman Esteban had predicted, fearless and instinctive, and possessed of a patience with animals that was entirely at odds with his general energy level, which remained high through his childhood and into his adolescence. He was 11 in 1891, and already beginning to be serious about the horses in a way that Theodore recognized and encouraged, because Theodore had learned, from watching Jacob, that the best thing you can do for a child who knows what they love is to take it seriously alongside them. Clara Louise Morgan was, at 8, exactly who Dolores Reyes had predicted on her first day of life, a person who decided whether situations were acceptable and said so. She had her mother's precision and her father's directness, and her brother Jacob's tendency to state conclusions before most people had even identified the question. And she was learning to read with a focus that reminded Theodore, privately, of Henrietta at the kitchen table with the accounts books. And he told Henrietta this one evening, and she looked at him with an expression of such complete warmth that he was briefly unable to speak. On a Sunday in the autumn of 1891, they all gathered at the Broken Spur for a dinner that had become a tradition. Jacob and his wife, a forthright young woman named Elena who had come from a Tucson family, and who Jacob had met at a cattle auction in the particular way of people who are both very serious about cattle and also apparently very interested in each other. Esteban, who had been offered a retirement in name but had declined it in fact, preferring to remain the ranch's senior hand on the grounds that retirement was a concept he had no use for. Agnes Boone, now a widow herself, but a comfortable and cheerful one who had become something close to family over the years, and Dr. Whitfield, now quite old and semi-retired, who appeared occasionally because Henrietta's cooking had become something he was not willing to give up. The table was full and loud. Robert and Clara argued cheerfully about something arcane concerning horses. Jacob and Elena talked quietly with the easy intimacy of people who have been together long enough to have a private language. Esteban told a story that Henrietta had heard 3 times before, but that was still good. Agnes Boone laughed at everything. Dr. Whitfield ate with the focus of someone who had decided that food was the primary pleasure of his twilight years. Theodore sat at the head of the table and watched all of it with the quiet, comprehensive attention that was his particular way of being in a moment, the way of someone who knows that a thing is good and wants to see it fully. Henrietta, carrying a dish from the kitchen, paused in the doorway and watched him watching them all. The lines of his face were deeper now, after 13 years of territory sun, and there was silver in the dark hair at his temples, And he was looking at his family, all of it. The stepson he had set aside cattle for, the daughter-in-law with the quick eyes, the boy who loved horses, the girl who decided things, the old cowboy who had once told a woman in a garden that his boss was a good man, and it was time someone said so. With an expression that was not quite any single emotion but all of them together, layered and settled and complete, he looked up and found her watching him. He smiled. The full smile, the unguarded one, the one she had first seen on a kitchen evening 14 years ago. She came to the table and set the dish down and took her seat, and everything continued, and everything was right. Later, much later, when the guests were gone and the children were in bed, and the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet, they sat together at the table with their coffee and the ledger between them, and it was the same table and the same ledger and the same two people, except that they were not the same at all. They were more, considerably more, the accumulated weight of every season they had carried together, and it sat on them comfortably. Like the coat you have broken in over many winters until it fits exactly the shape of you. The south field needs attention in the spring, Theodore said. The south field always needs attention in the spring, she said. True, he said. She looked at the ledger. The numbers were solid. The ranch was good. The cattle were healthy and the garden had gone in well and the children were asleep down the hall and Jacob was 12 miles east building something that was his, and Esteban was in the bunkhouse probably telling stories to the younger hands who were young enough to still find them new. Theodore, she said. Yes, he said. I would walk those 6 miles again, she said. Every one of them. He looked at her across the table, and his face was everything she had ever needed from a face, honest and warm and entirely, permanently present. So would I, he said, and I would open the gate faster, she laughed. He reached across the table and took her hand, and the lamp burned low between them, and the desert outside was vast and cold and studded with stars, and the broken spur sat in the middle of it like a heartbeat, patient and permanent and full of light. This was the life. Not the life she had planned or the life she had imagined, but the life she had walked toward in the red dust of 1878, past her own fear and into something she had not had a name for yet. She had a name for it now. It was called home, it was called loved, it was called exactly enough, and it was hers.